Okay, so hello again, grade 11. I think that you know that we're changing the format a little bit as it seems that we're not able to use the university campus and the movie cameras, et cetera, et cetera. So we're just doing this at home. It's going to be a little bit simpler. I just want to go over some of the points that you brought up in your homework regarding production and costs. I got the impression, to be honest, that some of you misunderstood what we were talking about. If you look at your handout, you'll see that, first of all, there's a lot of vocabulary that because it's fairly important that you understand what we're talking about. A lot of the abbreviations you can see in the graph, TC, VC, FC, these are all abbreviations that represent total costs, variable costs, and fixed costs. And I think that we've talked about this before, but it's worthwhile to go over it again. That variable costs are the costs that really only exist, let's say, in a car factory that you will find when the car factory is operational or is working, that the costs will actually go up. So it's going to go up. The costs are going to go up or down depending on how many units of production that you have produced. So if you're producing a car, then obviously the amount of glass or rubber or steel that you're going to be using is going to be going up. So that would be considered to be a variable cost. The fixed costs, of course, are the things that will not change depending on levels of production. And that might be things like um, taxes, for example, maybe the rent of the building, maybe even the salaries of the administration. I mean, myself as a teacher, I don't actually receive a bonus if there's an extra student, or I don't get my salary cut if a student decides to drop out of economics. So for that reason, we would be considered to be a fixed cost. So I think it's kind of important because if you go on to the section there about the decision on the second page, the decision of whether to produce or not to produce in the short run is kind of important. And I get the impression that many of you totally kind of misunderstood what we were talking about. So it says, given that there are fixed factors of production in the short run, this means that a firm must pay fixed costs even if output is zero. Okay, so this is a really good example during the coronavirus problems that we have here in Vietnam, because obviously there are a lot of businesses, a lot of shops and restaurants that, if there are no customers, if there is no hamburgers being produced or whatever, there are no bowls of noodles being produced, then you will still have to pay costs just to keep the business together. In other words, things like rent or whatever. There are certain costs, and this is one of the reasons why many businesses are going bankrupt. I mean, the airlines are probably the best example, where just the running of an airline, there's a lot of fixed costs. The airplane is the obvious one, where you're going to have the costs of paying back when you purchase all those airplanes. You've got to pay the interest, etc., on the purchase of the airplane, and obviously the petrol or the fuel, the aviation fuel for the airplane would be a variable cost, because the more you fly, the more you are going to be using the fuel. So for that reason, it should be quite obvious what the logic of this second page is all about. For example, if you have rented a building, then for the period of the rental contract, you will need to pay this rent whether or not you actually produce anything at all. The owner of the building does not care whether you produce or not, but just that you pay the rent. This means that a firm will lose an amount equal to their fixed costs, even if it does not sell anything. In other words, if you don't sell anything, you're still going to have to pay those fixed costs. That's assuming that you want to stay in the same building, et cetera, et cetera. The decision of whether it is financially viable to produce will therefore depend upon the variable costs and the cost that exists when producing, because the fixed costs must be paid anyways. The fixed costs are already spent and should not affect a decision about whether to continue to produce in the short run. Okay, so we get into other issues afterwards where we're dealing now with the variable costs, so that if the revenue earned from making and selling the units can at least cover the variable costs, then this means that it is financially worth producing them. So, you have to kind of accept the fixed costs, but if at least you can make money from selling the let's say, I don't know, the cars, for example, that you are producing, if you can make a profit from that, then in theory it should be financially worth producing them. So as I say, imagine that the fixed costs are $100. If the firm does not produce, then it makes a loss of $100. If it does produce and earns a $20, then its losses will be only $80. So what is this really telling us? This means that in theory, you could kind of minimize your losses by suggesting that, okay, well, we're only going to be losing $80 if we actually operate. We're not making a profit, but at least we're making $20, and $20, taken from $100 is going to be $80. So in fact, our losses are only going to be $80. Now, obviously, that's a good thing. And therefore, the argument would be that, yes, we need to allow the company to function. So, you're not really covering the fixed costs, but at least in the short run, you're able to minimize your losses. And this might be a logical argument to operate and not to close down. Maybe you could convince your bank manager that you won't need to have such a huge bank loan to survive if you still continue to operate. This means that it is better to produce than not to produce, even if a loss is being made, okay, so that you're minimizing your losses. The firm should therefore continue in production even though it makes a loss, because the revenue at least covers the variable costs. When the revenue only equals the variable costs, the loss will be the same whether producing or not producing. This is known as the shutdown point. Now, this is something that's kind of useful, particularly when dealing with bank managers, because they want to know, where is the shutdown point? In other words, what is the level of production that you need to produce in order to at least kind of like not lose money. So if the revenue is less than the variable cost, then the firm should not produce. Okay, so obviously that, if you're not even making anything at all, and that it's not even covering your variable cost, then you're obviously in big trouble. So in the long run, a firm will not continue producing if it's making a loss. It is not constrained by resources, and so it is not committed to fixed costs. The firm will produce only if it breaks even, that is, if all of its costs can be covered and at least make a normal profit. Now, if you look at the graph of the normal profit, and you should be able to draw the normal profit and the super normal profit graph, and also the loss graph as well, without any hesitation, okay? That should be able to be in your head so that you can quickly draw that. This is a really juicy opportunity for you to get a bonus mark when writing your final exam. Is they're always looking for relevant graphs, and if you can stick in a normal, super normal, or a loss graph, then that really will help you in the marks. And so, as I said to you, that the bank managers will definitely want to know, where are you breaking even? How many cars do you need to produce in a day for you to at least not lose any money? And then, obviously, the more serious point is, when do you need to actually shut down the factory? So, their decision as to whether they will lend you money or not lend you money will certainly be based on whether you are able to produce, to a level that you can make some money. Okay. We go on to the questions. Okay, the three questions, and this is something that I was really kind of concerned about. We talked about it a little bit in the last video, but I got the impression, to be honest, that you didn't quite understand things. So I wanted to go over it since we're all sitting around here anyways. And so I think it's important for you to think, okay, uh, how can we answer the question a little bit better? Um, Here it is here. Okay. So what you can do if you have no idea, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but just Google it, okay? Google the question, and you'd be surprised how efficient Google operates. That you can ask a question in normal English, probably even normal Vietnamese, and they will answer the question, okay? And so you could say, what type of business would be typical of a constant returns of scale, okay? And so you know what a constant returns of scale is. The percentage, if you sort of decide to increase, the investment, let's say by 10%, and you're able to make 10% more profit, then you may be pleased, I don't know, with a constant returns of scale. And then there's the sort of the diminishing returns of scale, and there's the increasing returns of scale. And if you Google it, and that's what I did, I looked up and I'm trying to find some concrete examples, because that's what I asked you on the paper, on the question. I said, I want some practical examples. In other words, give me a type of business where you could explain to me exactly what is a constant returns to scale. Okay. And if you looked it up in the book, okay, you could either look it up in the book or in another economics textbook, or just Google it or do something. But don't just sit there and just say, well, it means that if you sort of invest 10% more, that you'll get 10% greater output or something. That's not quite good enough. I'm looking for particularly the type of business that lends itself more adequately to constant returns to scale, for example. Okay? And if you looked it up, and this was kind of interesting for me as well, I learned something from the exercise, that they refer to constant returns to scale being very typical in very small businesses. Okay, and they gave an example of a car wash. Okay, and they said that if you actually try to double the number of people that you had and double the amount of space, that you would end up getting the exact same amount of output, and then then if it was smaller. Now this is an interesting example. I had to think about it for a few moments to see, do I agree with this or not? I don't agree with everything people tell me. But this is something which they felt, okay, most small businesses tend to have constant returns of scale. Okay, so when I'm trying to think of other small businesses, maybe if you were selling newspapers or you were selling drinks on the side of the road and you decided to invest a little bit more, would you actually make dramatically more money or less money depending on the business? Okay, so that's useful to know. Okay, that according to the people who look at statistics and calculate these things, they believe that a typical example of constant returns to scale would be small businesses such as a car wash. The next one was the economies of scale, and these would be increasing economies of scale. And so this would be a small number of large firms, such as a car factory, or they gave an example of an aviation industry like Boeing or Airbus, based in Paris, I think it is. Boeing is in Seattle in the United States. And they obviously get an advantage in large production, okay? Because we know what economies of scale is. We know what the graph looks like with the U-shaped average cost curve. And we know that as the production increase, the cost per units actually goes down, okay? So we've used that example a million times before, okay? The car factory where Toyota produces 1 million cars per day, and they're able to, you know, they're able to share the costs over a larger number of units of production, i.e., the cars, and by so doing, you're able to lower the cost of production. Okay, so the increasing economies of scale would be the large firms, and then you got the diseconomies of scale. Okay, the sort of the idea that money actually may go down the drain. The more you spend money, you may actually find it becomes more and more difficult to make money. And that really struck me, and I said, "Geez, you know what type of business, the more you spend, it is more likely that you're going to be losing money." Okay. And so they gave an example, and I thought it was an interesting example. Um, Again, I found it through just Googling it, which you can do too. And they talk about companies that are engaged with natural resources, and they gave things like gold mining companies or oil companies. Okay. And I thought we talked about this last time on the video, but maybe I didn't because most of you got the answer wrong. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to find easily extracted oil with time. The more you mine, the more expensive and deep does it cost to find more oil, as there is greater risk for failure, which is really interesting. Okay. The example they gave was actually the example in the Caribbean, probably before your time, but about 10 years ago, there was an oil drilling disaster where in the Caribbean, where there's lots of tourists and lots of hotels, and people don't want to lie on the beach where there's oil on the beach and it's all dirty and the water's all dirty. So it was considered to be a really big disaster, but there was millions of liters of oil spilling into the water from an underground drilling rig by BP, British Petroleum. And what they had done is that, because it's becoming more and more difficult to get the easy oil, you might say, countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, I mean, you just have to sort of dig a hole, with a shovel, and you probably start finding oil. Well, that type of oil is becoming more and more difficult to find. And so, it means that you need to use more and more resources to actually receive less and less oil. And for that reason, that they had gone, I think it was 3 kilometers into the water to the bottom of the sea, and then another 3 kilometers digging under the seabed. And this was also true in the North Sea. In the North Sea, Great Britain has been making a lot of money, Norway as well, by drilling rigs in the North Sea. Well, in the first couple of years, you could just drill very easily something, that would reach to the bottom of the North Sea and there would be oil coming out. Well, now it's like 3 or 4 kilometers. Can you imagine how technically difficult that must be to actually drill 3 or 4 kilometers below the surface of the bottom of the North Sea to actually get oil? So what that means is that, it's becoming, you're spending more and more and you're getting less and less. Now, if that's not an example of diseconomies of scale, what is? So that would be certainly an example of decreasing returns to scale. So these are the concrete examples that I'm looking for. And I think that you need to take a bit of extra care when answering these questions, because you're not really reading the question. I didn't just say, well, just work out the arithmetic. And so you tell me, okay, well, if you have 10% more, you're going to get 10% sort of less or something like that. I wanted something like a practical example of a business operation. And if you don't know, just try a bit harder. I mean, it took me 5 minutes to look it up in Google, and I found the answer. I found a concrete example. I knew the idea and the logic of it, but I couldn't actually think of a concrete example. And I thought that this was a good challenge for you to teach you to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, we're coming up to the exams eventually, and you're not going to have the opportunity to Google something or to look it up in encyclopedia. I don't know if those exist anymore. But the bottom line is that you need to get your act together a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. This was a fairly quick little mini video. This wasn't a proper video that I was going to be teaching a new lesson on. In fact, the next lesson, which will be done, I think is this Thursday, I'm going to put on Thursday or Friday, maybe, I'm not too sure now, is all about profit theory. Okay, so if you want to look it up, and if you've done all your homework, then that's good. But to be brutally honest, the grade 11 class, there's only about 6 of you who have done all of your work. There's about 5 of you who have done almost no work at all, and I'm not impressed, and your parents aren't impressed, and the school is not impressed. So you may think that this is really funny, that you're taking a holiday. Everybody is working really hard. Okay, we all know that it's difficult in Vietnam, and that we're stuck at home. I don't like it either. You don't like it either. We don't meet our friends. We don't socialize. But that's how it is. Okay, your grandparents suffered by going to war, and now you are suffering by sitting on the sofa. So I would think that your challenge is a lot less stressful than what your great grandparents and your grandparents had to put up with to in Vietnam's moment of crisis. And this is a moment of crisis for Vietnam too. And I expect all of you to be working hard. The administration of Chu Van An are working hard. I'm working hard, and you should be working hard too. Okay, so I'm going to send out another video in a couple of days' time about profit theory. If you have finished all your work, then start reading up about it, and I will send you a new handout on what profit theory is all about. So until I see you again, bye bye.